They didn't announce this. They tried to slip it through unnoticed. Here's the contradiction. While Donald Trump publicly attacks fraud almost daily, a quiet series of pardons tells the opposite story. And this isn't an abstract political fight. This affects you because the pardon power sits at the very top of the justice system. When it's used this way, the rules you're told to follow stop applying equally. Fact. According to the provided transcript, over the past week, Donald Trump issued multiple grants of clemency and pardons with no major public announcements. The New York Times later reported that several of the recipients had been convicted of large-scale fraud and corruption. Inference. The lack of public rollout reduced immediate scrutiny and delayed public awareness. But here's the part most people haven't processed yet. These weren't edge cases. They weren't old mistakes. The reporting points to a repeatable pattern involving money, access, and personal proximity to Trump. Fact. The New York Times article referenced in the transcript is titled, "Trump Set Fraudsters Free from Prison a Second Time" by Ken Vogel and Suzanne Craig, and it describes a concentrated wave of clemency grants carried out quietly within days. And here's the detail that changes everything. One of the people freed had already been pardoned once, committed another fraud, was convicted again, and then pardoned again. This is where the story stops being about forgiveness and starts becoming about leverage, because once a system does this twice, it's no longer an exception, it's a signal. This didn't happen in isolation. It fits a pattern that's been building quietly, pardon by pardon, long before this week. For this fact, the transcript describes Trump's recent clemency grants as part of an ongoing pattern, noting that some recipients had either donated large sums to Trump-aligned super PACs or hired lawyers closely connected to Trump, including attorneys who previously represented him. Inference. The overlap between money, legal representation, and pardons suggests the process was not random or merit-based. Notice what's missing from this picture. There's no mention of rehabilitation, no long passage of time, no public review, none of the traditional filters that once defined how pardons were supposed to work. Fact, as explained in the transcript, the Department of Justice historically used a formal pardon process involving teams of staff, timing requirements, and evaluations of whether applicants admitted guilt, served their sentences, and demonstrated meaningful rehabilitation. Many applications were rejected simply based on how recent the offense was. Now watch how fast this escalates. The people being pardoned here weren't decades removed from their crimes. Some were still close to the conduct that put them behind bars. And in at least one case, the system had already failed once. Fact, the transcript details the case of Adriana Camberos, who was convicted of fraud, received clemency in 2021, was later convicted again in 2024 for an unrelated fraud involving counterfeit 5-hour energy drinks, and then received clemency again. Inference. Repeating clemency after a second conviction removes the deterrent effect of punishment entirely. So the real question isn't whether pardons are constitutional. It's this. If clemency keeps flowing to the same circle of people, what behavior does that quietly encourage next? Here's where the pattern stops being subtle. Fact. The transcript describes another clemency recipient connected to a major political corruption case involving the former governor of Puerto Rico. The individuals involved, including a former FBI agent, pleaded guilty. One key figure, Julio Herrera, was convicted in a bribery scandal tied directly to that administration. Inference. These were not technical violations or paperwork crimes. They were core corruption cases involving public power and bribery. But here's the part nobody can brush off as coincidence. Herrera's daughter, Isabella Herrera, donated $2.5 million to MAGA Inc., a super PAC devoted to Donald Trump and his allies. Notice what happens next. Fact. According to the transcript, Herrera's lawyer was Christopher Kaise, one of the lead attorneys on Donald Trump's own legal defense team. That same lawyer negotiated an unusually lenient outcome with Trump's Department of Justice, reducing the consequences to misdemeanors. After that, another $1 million was donated. Then clemency followed. Inference. The sequence. Donation, legal access, leniency, more donations, pardon, creates the appearance of a transactional loop. This is where the story flips from controversial to destabilizing, because the issue isn't whether any single pardon can be defended. It's what happens when the same signals repeat over and over in case after case. Fact, the transcript emphasizes that multiple recipients shared common traits, significant donations to Trump-aligned political groups or representation by lawyers directly connected to Trump. When those are the traits being rewarded, the message becomes unmistakable. Justice doesn't hinge on what you did, it hinges on who you can reach. And once that message lands, it doesn't stay contained to one administration. It spreads. Now watch how fast this starts to spiral. Fact, the transcript stacks multiple developments together: repeated fraud-related pardons, political corruption cases receiving clemency, and January 6th related pardons, including individuals convicted of seditious conspiracy tied to the Capitol attack. Inference. The expansion of clemency across unrelated but politically sensitive cases signals that the guardrails around the pardon power are weakening all at once. Then comes the part that sounds almost unbelievable. Fact. As stated in the transcript, the January 6th pardons may have been written so broadly that they potentially covered the suspected pipe bomber. The individual allegedly argued that because Trump said everybody on J6 gets a pardon, they believed they were included. Let that sit for a second. This is where the story flips again, because this isn't about intent anymore. It's about loss of control. Fact, the transcript describes these pardons as being issued quietly, in rapid succession, without the traditional review process that once filtered out dangerous or premature clemency requests. Inference. When pardons are issued broadly and informally, unintended protections can be created for people never meant to be shielded. And here's the dangerous part. Once the message spreads that loyalty and proximity can override consequences, people don't wait for permission. They act first and rationalize later. Fact, the transcript frames this moment as part of a larger pattern of escalating norm breaking, moving from white-collar fraud to political violence-related cases. This isn't a slow drift, it's compression. Multiple stress points hitting the system at once, faster than it can respond. So the question isn't whether this was reckless. It's simpler and more unsettling. What happens if this continues? Now shift the camera away from Washington for a moment, because this is where it stops being abstract and starts landing in real life. Fact. The transcript repeatedly contrasts how clemency was granted to fraud and corruption defendants with how the justice system normally treats ordinary people, emphasizing that traditional pardon standards required time served, accountability, and clear rehabilitation. Inference. When those standards disappear at the top, the consequences don't stay there. They move downward. If you've ever been told there are no shortcuts, this is the shortcut. If you've ever watched someone get hammered for a fraction of what others did, this explains why. The system you interact with every day still demands rules, paperwork, deadlines, penalties, but above you, those rules are suddenly optional. Notice what they didn't deny. No one in this reporting claims these recipients went through the normal process. No one argues they earned forgiveness through time or reform. The defense is silence. Fact. The transcript makes clear that many of these clemency decisions bypass the DOJ's traditional pardon review structure, including staff evaluations and input from prosecutors who originally handled the cases. That creates a split reality. One system for people with access, another for everyone else. And that gap doesn't feel theoretical when you're dealing with fines, court dates, background checks, or sentencing guidelines. It feels personal because it tells you exactly where you stand. If this feels familiar, say so in the comments. Not politically, personally, because once people internalize that fairness is conditional, trust doesn't erode slowly, it drops. And that sets up the most dangerous part of this story, which isn't outrage. It's how systems quietly adapt to signals like this. This is where you have to step back, because outrage alone doesn't explain how this keeps happening. Fact. The transcript describes how the pardon system was designed to operate as part of a broader justice framework, with safeguards, institutional memory, and professional review inside the Department of Justice. Inference. When those safeguards are removed, the system doesn't collapse loudly. It reroutes itself. Here's the unsettling mechanism at work. Power doesn't need to announce corruption. It just needs to change incentives. Once people see that donations, loyalty, or proximity can produce outcomes faster than accountability, behavior adjusts automatically. Notice what's driving this. Speed, silence, spectacle elsewhere. These pardons weren't defended on principle. They were buried under noise. While attention was pulled to rallies, investigations, and headlines, clemency quietly moved in the background. Fact. The transcript emphasizes that these grants were issued quietly, without major announcements, even as Trump publicly focused attention on other controversies and claims of fraud. That's not a flaw. It's a strategy. Inference. When attention is fragmented, systems of accountability weaken, not because they're defeated, but because they're bypassed. And here's the part that should unsettle you. This doesn't require everyone involved to be malicious. It only requires enough people to understand the signal. Lawyers adjust, donors adjust, defendants adjust, everyone learns what works. This is how norms don't just break, they get replaced. And once a new operating logic takes hold, reversing it becomes harder than stopping it ever was, because now the question isn't whether this violates tradition, it's whether the system still remembers how to function without it. Now look forward, because this story doesn't end with what already happened. It ends with what this makes possible next. Fact. In the transcript, the speakers openly speculate that Trump could eventually issue blanket pardons, potentially covering members of his administration, allies, or anyone tied to his inner circle, excluding only those who fell out of favor. Inference. Once individualized pardons become routine, the leap to broad, preemptive protection becomes smaller and more tempting. There are two paths forming here, and neither is hypothetical. One path is normalization. Pardons like these stop shocking people. They become background noise. Each one draws less reaction than the last. The system adjusts around them, lawyers plan for them, political actors assume them. Accountability becomes something you argue about on TV, not something you expect to happen. The other path is acceleration. Fact, the transcript frames Trump's use of the pardon power as becoming more raw, more openly transactional, and less constrained by norms or optics. Inference. If the incentives remain unchanged, future uses of clemency won't be quieter. They'll be faster, broader, and more explicit. And here's the tension point. Systems under pressure don't usually snap all at once. They slide until a moment forces a response. That moment doesn't announce itself ahead of time. It arrives when expectations collide with reality. Right now, the next move isn't written down, but the direction is. And whether this story becomes a footnote or a turning point depends on what happens the next time the pardon power is tested, because there will be a next time. Here's the insight that ties all of this together. This was never just about pardons. It was about what power does when it stops pretending to justify itself. Fact. Throughout the transcript, the speakers return to the same point. The pardon power was designed to function in good faith, assuming restraint, norms, and concern for legitimacy. They describe how those assumptions break down when a president no longer cares about process, reputation, or consistency. Inference. When good faith disappears, loopholes stop being exceptions and start becoming tools. That's the reframe. The scandal isn't that controversial people were pardoned. It's that the system revealed exactly how it can be bent, reused, and scaled. Once that knowledge is public, it doesn't go away. It becomes precedent without being written down. This story isn't finished because the mechanism is still active. What you're watching isn't the end of an abuse. It's the tutorial phase. And here's the part to remember going forward. The most dangerous shifts in power don't look dramatic. They look procedural, quiet, boring, until one day they're the only rules left. If you want to understand what happens next, before it's obvious, follow and subscribe. We're going to keep tracking how this evolves because the next move is already forming, whether anyone admits it or not.